Great. Thank you, Sean, and welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. We're very pleased to have you with us again today for the HOME-ARP office hours. My name is Jessica Lurs. I'm a HUD technical assistance provider with APT Associates and joined by my colleague at ICF, Marion, today. She's going to come on and say hello.
Morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Jessica said, my name is Marion Goldburn, and I'm a technical assistant provider with ICF, and glad to be here today for this quarterly office hour.
Thanks, Marion. Marion and I are going to kind of help facilitate the questions later on in today's office hours. But before we get to that, I just want to introduce our esteemed HUD colleagues who will be doing some presentations this afternoon. So if we can go to the next slide. We are glad to have with us Jeannie Sardone, the Director of the Office of Affordable Housing Programs. And we'll also be joined by 2 affordable housing specialists, Courtney and Teresa, and then 3 grants management specialists, Daniel, Jadiza, and Agina. So we'll have them talk with us later on, but just as a reminder, we will be looking to take questions that you might have about any of the information presented today. So please use the chat feature and we will make sure that we try to get to questions as we can. So next slide. Today we're going to go through introductions and the HOME-ARP program status, followed by HOME-ARP activities, rental operating, and tenant-based rental assistance. And then we'll talk about reporting HOME-ARP activities and accomplishments in IDIS. And then we'll go into our questions and answers. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jeannie.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. We're really pleased to be with you again for another quarterly office hours. Can we advance the slide? Before I turn it over to my very hardworking, amazing staff, I'm going to just give you a few updates about where we are, basically the status of the program nationally. So there are 648 participating jurisdictions that were eligible for HOME-ARP allocation. We had 5 of these PJs that opted not to accept their HOME-ARP funds, which left us with 643 PJs in the program. And to date, we have accepted the allocation plans of 638 PJs. So we're at 98% plus with accepted allocation plans who are now moving either well into or moving into administering their programs. And we have 5 plans that have not yet been accepted. They have been resubmitted with changes, or they're under review by the HUD field office, but we are very, very close to having all the plans in and approved, which will be a great milestone for the program. Slide, please. Okay, so wanted to talk a little bit about, based upon approved plans, what the uses of HOME-ARP look like nationally. And it's interesting how, even though the activities are a bit different than regular home, sort of these numbers look surprisingly similar. So we have almost half of HOME-ARP funds that are going to be used for rental housing, 5% for tenant-based rental assistance, 17% for supportive services, even though we have a lot of supportive services activities set up in IDIS and sort of those programs well underway, and 14% non-congregate shelter. We have just 1% being used for nonprofit operating, and another 1% for capacity building. And based upon plans, about 12% of total grants being used for admin by PJs. By the end of the program, it's our understanding that we will have produced more than 22,000 units of rental housing and supported another basically 2,700. So that will be a sort of a very significant increase in affordable units for these very vulnerable populations. Slide, please. So just in terms of where we are with projects committed and projects sort of expenditures of HOME-ARP funds, to date, we have 552 open projects or activities in IDIS. So that means supportive services programs, TBRA programs, non-congregate shelter or rental projects set up in the system, 552 open, and another 34 projects already completed, and that includes some rental units. In terms of expenditures, the expenditures are actually, and somewhat surprisingly, kind of following along with the overall allocation of funds in plans, with about 51% of all the money that's been expended for rental, which is a little bit surprising because rental projects tend to spend out at a slightly slower rate. 29% for non-congregate shelter, 16% for supportive services, and 5% for TBRA, which is exactly the same as the sort of the allocation of funds in plans. So we've to date expended $200 million on projects and activities for HOME-ARP. This is a number that we watch closely because Congress watches it closely and we report on it regularly to them. So we're happy to see projects finally getting up and underway and people being served in your communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to sort of start a walkthrough of some of the HOME-ARP activities. Dan?
Thanks, Jenny. Can we get the next slide, please? All right. And then the next slide after that. There we go. Great. Okay, so my name is Dan Coughlin. I'm Grant Management Specialist for HOME-ARP, outstationed in the Philadelphia field office. I'll be discussing eligible costs within the HOME-ARP rental housing activity. Can I get the next slide? So first and foremost, the eligible costs for the rental housing activity are found in the HOME-ARP notice, section 6.B.5. I've grouped them under general topics here for convenience, and we'll discuss them in the following order. Eligible development costs, as you can see, rental development, relocation costs in service to rental development, and then rental operating. And I just wanted to draw out specifically here, we're going to discuss two different kinds of rental operating assistance, ongoing operating cost assistance payments and capitalized operating cost assistance reserve accounts that can be created. Next slide, please. Okay, so first we have the meat and potatoes of the activity, right, which is rental development, right? So that's the building of rental housing. The eligible developmental costs include hard and soft costs, including construction, rehab, acquisition, or demolition of property. That's all in the furtherance of rental development. Many people on the call know this already, but the difference between hard costs and soft costs, key to know here. Hard costs are going to be essential to the physical construction process. Soft costs are not. They're more directly related to things like necessary costs that go towards the financing or development of a project, like architect or engineer plans, settlement fees, project audit, environmental review, stuff like that. Hard costs are lumber, nails, labor, maybe the cost of purchasing land, hooking up utilities. There you go. So with regard to hard and soft costs, right, and any direct development costs that go into construction, rehab, acquisition, or demolition, a couple of important caveats. All of these development costs are only eligible if the project they're developing qualifies as a HOME-ARP project, and then as well, if they contribute to the project meeting the relevant construction or rehab standard, and then finally, whether the project can be completed within the time frame for HOME-ARP project completion. My colleague Jadzia is going to discuss that in further detail in a moment, but for now, just take as read that for development costs to be eligible, they have to be developing a project that meets the requirements of the HOME-ARP notice. Okay, so speaking to refinancing to achieve affordability, I've defined it there as refinancing to achieve affordability rather than refinancing, just to highlight how limited the eligible cost for refinancing really is, right? Refinancing, so you can only refinance existing debt as an eligible cost when that debt is secured by a home project that is, or home ARP project that is being rehabilitated when refinancing is necessary to permit or continue affordability. That if you were going to do that, your project would also have to meet any guidelines that were also established by the PJ in the home ARP allocation plan. And those guidelines would have to be adhered to. And then finally, for this slide, just discussing loan repayment. So when is loan repayment an eligible cost is also a good question. So you can use home ARP dollars to pay the principal and interest of a bridge loan or a construction loan or a guaranteed loan. When the loan itself was used for eligible costs specified under this section of the home ARP notice concerned with this activity, right? And that's this activity only, rental housing only. And beyond that, the project must also meet the general requirements of the notice. You know, that's no surprise. And then perhaps most importantly, home ARP funds have to be included in the project from the beginning. So if you have a project that didn't include home ARP dollars, right, from the beginning, then and required a loan in order to start it, and you're now years down the line, you cannot use home ARP dollars to repay that loan. It has to be a loan that was taken with the goal of working on a home ARP project. Next slide, please. Okay. So moving on to our next group. Our next group of eligible costs concerns relocation payments to people temporarily or permanently displaced by rental development projects, right? So you can see here, I've listed out the eligible costs. That includes the replacement housing payments, payments for moving expenses, payments for out-of-pocket costs, and really any staffing or overhead costs that go towards accomplishing those first three items, right? So speaking to relocation costs, anytime that you do relocation costs with home ARP dollars, they're going to have to comply with the requirements CFR 92.353. I'm not going to go into detail on 92.353. I just want to establish that 92.353 indicates it establishes minimums that the PJ has to meet for permanently displaced persons and temporary relocations, as well as guidelines for establishing optional relocation assistance and an anti-displacement relocation assistance plan. It's very important to review that before you try to use home ARP dollars for relocation. So just make sure to review that statute. Next slide, please. Okay, our final group of eligible costs concerns the options available within the rental housing activity to provide ongoing operating support for rental housing projects created with home ARP funds. There are two options here, as I indicated earlier, providing a project with ongoing operating cost assistance, that's this slide, and establishing a capitalized operating cost assistance reserve account, which is the next slide. So ongoing operating cost assistance is exactly what it sounds like. It's ongoing payments to a project that cover operating cost deficits. These payments can only be made during the home ARP budget period, as is indicated there. So the last time you could make an ongoing operating cost assistance payment is going to be September 30th, 2030, right? So it is important to think about that when you're thinking about the long-term financial viability of a project, right? It can only assistance like operating assistance up until September 30th, 2030. Many of your rental housing projects are going to go on for vastly longer than that. So it is worthwhile to think, okay, is this the right choice for me to do ongoing operating cost assistance, right? So past that, with regard to eligible costs within this cost, they're limited to the amount necessary to address operating deficits associated with home ARP rental housing units, right? That's another thing to think about in terms of financial viability for the long term, right? So I have the lists of the costs listed here. It includes admin expenses, property management fees, insurance, utilities, property taxes, maintenance, resident services coordinator, property management fees. And then finally, you can establish a replacement reserve account for major systems. So just consider that for a moment in terms of thinking about what that looks like for the financial viability of your project, right? If you have an operating deficit that does not encompass these costs, these eligible costs, right? That means that you would have an operating deficit that needs to be addressed in advance, right? Because you would not have the capacity to draw operating cost assistance to pay for something that's not in this list of eligible costs, right? So just something to keep in mind in terms of thinking of the financial viability of the project. Next slide, please. Okay, This is our final slide before I'm going to transition to Jadzia, and this is just, again, the capitalized operating cost assistance reserve. This is very much like the operating cost assistance payments. The major difference is that when you do this capitalized operating cost assistance reserve, you are putting a set amount of capital into a reserve account from the beginning, right? That amount is limited to the amount necessary to address operating deficits associated with home-ARP rental housing units, right? The eligible costs are identical. They're the same as they are for the operating cost assistance payments, right? So you can see them listed there. They include the replacement reserve account. The only thing that I would add to this is that when you think about capitalized operating cost assistance reserve, you have options in terms of how you would put money into the replacement reserve account for major systems, right? You can create a larger pool reserve account for all the units that you're working on, or you can make periodic payments into reserve accounts that are, set aside for each unit. Final point here, or rather two-part point, but you cannot use both ongoing cost assistance and a operating cost assistance reserve to support a single rental project. It's a key thing there. And it's purely for the fact that that would cause, overlap, right? You would have a situation where if you're making ongoing cost assistance payments and you had set aside an amount that was for the full amount to replace to pay for all operating deficit for a project, you would find yourself paying for the same thing twice, right? Either way you go on that, we want to really, lay down, to say expressly here, the PJ has to establish the requirement for operating cost assistance in its written agreement with the rental project owner or sponsor or developer, including how cost assistance will be provided. If that's not in the written agreement from the beginning, it needs to be added, and you cannot do cost assistance without adding it to the written agreement. Okay, so thanks very much for your time, and I'm going to transition to Jadzia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jadzia Hardiman, and I'm a grants management specialist serving California and in the interim Nevada. I'm going to discuss rental housing reporting requirements that are stated in the HOME-ARP notice. First up today is project completion and occupancy requirements. HOME-ARP rental projects must be completed within 4 years of project commitment. What needs to be done for the project to be reported as completed in IDIS is that all construction is complete, any title transfers that need to be done are complete, and the project meets all the property standards. There may be an overlay of local, maybe state property standards, but also your HOME-ARP property standard requirements. Additionally, the final drawdown for the capital funds for this project has been dispersed. At that point, the project is completed, and this would all need to happen within the 4-year time frame. It's best practice to set your deadline less than 4 years so that if there are any bumps in the road, you can work on the project to complete all requirements before the 4-year maximum deadline. Since HOME-ARP is a housing production program, in addition to meeting the project completion deadline, HUD wants to make sure that the units are occupied. For the occupancy deadline, within 6 months of completion, the project should be occupied by qualifying populations or low-income households. If at the 6-month mark and units are not occupied, the PJ may need to explain their marketing and outreach efforts and how they will ensure that within the 12-month timeline, the units will be filled with eligible households. If the PJ fails to show that it can occupy units within the 12 months of completion, then the HOME-ARP funds would need to be repaid. So please make sure that you are tracking your projects and that you're getting the reports from the property owner in a timely manner so that you can report it into IDIS. To report beneficiary information in IDIS, you will need to reopen the completed activity. Next slide, please. Next, we'll be discussing units. The unit information will be reported in the accomplishment section of the project in IDIS. So HOME-ARP was designed to primarily serve households that fall under the 4 qualifying populations. But under rental housing, there's an additional flexibility that is being provided in that not 100% of the HOME-ARP rental units must be occupied by the QPs. This means that not less than 70% of a PJ's entire portfolio of rental units assisted with HOME-ARP funds must be restricted to households that are qualifying populations at the time of their initial occupancy, What this also means is that not more than 30% of total HOME-ARP rental units may be restricted for occupancy by low-income households. In the accomplishment screen in IDIS, you will report on the total number of units that were completed, total units that were assisted with HOME-ARP funds, and the total number of QP units. Remember that QP stands for qualifying populations. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little about the affordability period, which is the minimum 15-year compliance period. It doesn't matter the type of assistance provided by your HOME-ARP funds or the activity, all HOME-ARP projects will have the 15-year compliance period as a minimum. PJs could choose to have a longer compliance period, but keep in mind that under the HOME-ARP rules, you will be able to provide additional operating assistance to cover, you will not be able to provide additional operating cost assistance to cover those shortfalls during an extended compliance period. In the IDIS accomplishment screen, the affordability period is automatically set to the minimum period of 15 years. A PJ only needs to enter something if it is more than the minimum period, which can happen if the project has a project-based rental assistance payments in place. In that case, the compliance period will be the greater of the minimum 15-year compliance period or the term on the HAP contract. For example, if the HAP contract states the compliance period is 20 years for a project, then the PJ would choose the greater number, which is 20 years instead of the 15-year minimum, and record that affordability period in IDIS. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Oh, yes. So now let's briefly discuss the beneficiary information that would need to be uploaded into IDIS. All unit occupancy data must be uploaded for the project to be closed out in IDIS. So for qualifying population households, you'll need to report the monthly rent. PJs must establish policies and procedures for determining a reasonable contribution to rent while following the process described in the notice. Rent cannot exceed the HOME-ARP rent limits except units that receive project or tenant-based rental assistance. The PJ will also need to collect data on which qualifying population definition the household met, the household size, and their demographic information. Additionally, the PJ needs to know in IDIS whether the household or unit receives rental assistance. Next slide, please. Okay, so beneficiary data needed for low-income households. For these units, the household must qualify as low income at initial occupancy and each year throughout the compliance period. The beneficiary information that will need to be uploaded into IDIS for low-income households is the monthly rent again. The rent amount may not exceed the home rent limits except units that receive project or tenant-based rental assistance. The PJ needs to keep income determination documents used to determine the household's initial and ongoing eligibility and contribution to rent to show that the household status is low income. Additionally, the household size and demographic information will need to be input into IDIS. Percentage of median income, again, their eligibility as a low-income household based on the definition of annual income in the notice. And lastly, whether the household or unit receives rental assistance. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you, everyone. I'm now passing the presentation on to Teresa.
Thank you, Jadzia. Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Palacio, and I am an affordable housing specialist here at headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to talk to you about HOME-ARP rental and rental operating in terms of IDIS. So as Dan mentioned, to have a rental operating activity, your written agreement must include both the rental and rental operating cost. So once you've met all of those policy requirements, you can go ahead and set up your rental operating activity in IDIS. A couple things really quickly about rental and rental operating in IDIS is that they're linked, but they are separate activities. So each activity has its own ID. The rental operating activity cannot exist without a completed rental activity that is also marked as needing rental operating assistance. And to mark your rental operating to mark your rental activity as needing rental operating assistance, what you're going to do is navigate to your rental activity in IDIS. So this is an example screen here. And to get to the accomplishment screen, you're going to follow this arrow right here and select Add Home Accomplishments, and that will take you here. So the completion activity type and the property type are two of the required fields on this screen. So you'll need to answer those questions before you can move on. And then that question here, the big bolded square, I want you to remember to provide rental operating assistance. Again, it has to be included in your written agreement. And we really like to tell folks to always have that on hand when you're entering any of your information in IDIS. And that's really going to help you here because you can look at your written agreement and you'll know whether or not you're going to need that rental operating assistance. So for our example, we went ahead and selected yes, that we will need rental operating. And if we scroll down, you'll be able to see the rest of the information that is required for the accomplishments. That will include the total completed units. I apologize, my animations are not working. That the total information, excuse me, the rest of the required information on the accomplishment screen includes the total completed units, total HOME-ARP assisted units, and the total HOME-ARP QP units. After we enter that information, we'll scroll down to the bottom of the screen and select Save. That will take us to this screen here, which is our second page of accomplishments. And you'll need to enter the lead paint requirement question. And then that'll take you, then after you answer that, you can select the cost tab. And this is what that cost tab looks like. It's just, this is where you'll enter all the costs that were incurred for this rental activity. And then the next thing you'll do is move to that beneficiaries tab. And so this is what the beneficiary screen looks like. This is where you're going to enter all your demographic data. So Jadzia mentioned that some of this information that you're required to report per the notice is here on these screens. So this is where you're going to enter that in IDIS. First, you're going to enter the number of bedrooms, then the occupant, and then you're going to enter the qualifying population. One thing that I want you to know, it did not work. Okay, I apologize. We were having some technical difficulties. Okay, so you're not going to be able to see it because my animations are being funny. But on the qualifying population, I want you to remember that if you select low-income household, then and only then is that percent median income going to enable. So any other QP selected, that field is not enabled. So yeah, just make sure if you need to select low-income household, you do, and then that's when that drop-down will be enabled for you. The next category you're going to answer is Hispanic or Latino. Then we select our race, our household size, our household type, veteran status, and assistance type. So for this example, we've gone ahead and entered all of our information. You'll notice that the bottom 3 rows list the occupant as vacant. So you can complete a rental activity in IDIS with vacant units. So just remember, though, that when you go to close out your grant in IDIS, those units will need to be updated. That's my quick grant closeout plug. Go to HUD.gov, check out our webinar on that. But just know for rental activities, you can complete them with vacant units. Okay, so we've gone ahead and entered our beneficiary data, and now we've gone ahead and saved. We got our page refresh and this nice little message that tells us that our completion data has been saved, and now we can complete our rental activity. So for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and say that we already did that. And so since we've set up our rental activity, we've completed it, now we're ready to set up our rental operating activity. Once these activities are set up in IDIS, they are linked. So all of the setup and accomplishment data that you enter on that regular rental activity screen is going to populate over to the rental operating screens. And I'll show you that and what that looks like in just a moment. A couple other things. If that regular rental activity that you linked to this rental operating activity, If that regular rental activity is reopened or canceled, IDIS isn't going to allow you to do anything with that rental operating activity. And lastly, rental operating activities aren't subject to that 4-year project completion requirement that your regular rental activities are. So if you have an activity that is in completed status and was marked as needing rental operating assistance on that accomplishment screen that we just went through, then when you go to set up a new rental activity, this is that first screen that you're going to see. It's asking you if this activity that you're trying to set up is a rental operating activity. And if you say yes, then this little drop down is going to appear, and it gives us the option to link this rental operating activity to that regular rental activity that we had just completed. And so you see it has the IDIS activity ID listed there, as well as the activity name. So we're going to select that and click save, and then the page will refresh, and this is what your setup detail screen for your rental operating is going to look like in IDIS. So you can see the only information that you can even edit on this screen is the operating cost assistance type. And remember, Dan talked to us about those types earlier. So because of all of his great information, you're going to know exactly which one to select. And then there are a couple places on this screen that show you what data has been copied over. And so my arrow is not going to move to where I would like it to, but to the right of it, you can see it says setup data based on completed HOME-ARP rental activity, and then it lists the ID, and then it gives you a nice little timestamp of when that information was copied over. All of the information is included. Written agreement date is there, and activity addresses, and all of your activity estimates. So that is IDIS for HOME-ARP rental and rental operating activities. I am going to hand it over to Agina to go ahead and talk to you about TBRA.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, everyone. My name is Agina Sharif. I am a grants management specialist for HOME-ARP. I am outstationed in the Louisville
Regina, I think we lost your audio.
Notice CPD 2110, the waivers and alternative requirements appendix to the notice, and the home regulations. You will see here that PJs are permitted to pay up to 100% of rent and security deposits in HOME-ARP TBRA. Security deposits may not exceed the equivalent of 2 months' rent, and these deposits can be provided as a grant or loan. Next slide, please. PJs are permitted to pay the full cost of monthly gas, electric, water, and sewer utilities for HOME-ARP TBRA beneficiaries. PJs are also permitted to pay up to 100% of a utility deposit when rental assistance or a security deposit payment is provided on behalf of a HOME-ARP TBRA assisted household. Utility deposits may not be provided on their own. PJs may also use HOME-ARP TBRA funds to pay for the allowable costs incurred for implementing and carrying out eligible HOME-ARP TBRA activities. These project costs include things like the cost of inspecting the housing unit, determining the income eligibility of the family, determining the rental assistance payment, and staff costs to administer the TBRA program. Next slide, please. As a reminder, only individuals and families in the qualifying populations are eligible to receive HOME-ARP TBRA assistance. For more information about QP definitions, please refer to Section 4A of the notice. Additional information about HOME-ARP TBRA reporting requirements can be found in Section 8G3 of the notice. PJs are required to report, go back one slide, thank you. PJs are required to report the beneficiary information that you see on this slide in IDIS at the time assistance is provided. Please note that the amount paid for a utility deposit is only required when the PJ covers these costs. Now I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Courtney to share more information about IDIS reporting requirements for HOME-ARP TBRA.
Thanks, Agina. Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Christensen, and I am an affordable housing specialist in the Financial and Information Services Division here at headquarters. So I am going to talk to you about TBRA in IDIS, and I'll start off by saying that there are a lot of similarities to TBRA for homes. So for those of you who have done that before, there aren't too many changes. But I do want to draw your attention to just a couple of things, and in particular, one system update in IDIS for TBRA overall. So first, I'd like to make sure to draw your attention to the fact that you cannot fund your activity unless you have executed rental assistance agreements. And these need to be funded for the total amount in those executed, not an estimated amount for how much you might spend for TBRA overall, but what is actually reflective of those executed agreements for qualifying households. Also, IDIS limits the funded amount that you can enter for your TBRA activity based on the subsidy information that you've entered. So this is the kind of system update or limitation that I just mentioned. You actually cannot go in and fund your activity for more than what is calculated based on the information you've entered for the qualifying households with whom you have an executed rental agreement. So that last point there in orange, we really want to make clear and draw everyone's attention to. You won't be able to complete the activity if the funded amount does not equal the amount eligible for TBRA funding. We're going to get into that and how it's calculated in just a second when we get into the demo. But again, that is a calculated number based on the subsidy and beneficiary information that you enter while setting up your activity. Okay, so before we dive into the demo here, I also just want to remind everyone that PJs have two options for how they set up TBRA activities. They can either set up a single activity for each household or the rental or each rental assistance contract, or they can do something called batch setup, which would be just one IDIS activity for the entire TBRA program that the PJ is administering. And that would mean that all of the households with whom you have a rental assistance contract get entered as TBRA beneficiaries for this one activity. This distinction is going to be important in a couple of slides when we get to the written agreement execution date field. So to set up your activity, you'd follow the same steps that you would for any other HOME-ARP activity and enter TBRA as the tenure type. Then here on the setup detail screen, you see that we have a written agreement execution date field. And as I mentioned, this is where that single versus batch setup is important. The written agreement execution date is the date of your earliest executed rental assistance contract with an owner, tenant, or sponsor of a QP household. So if you are doing the single setup, you will only have one written agreement execution date or one written agreement to enter for the written agreement execution date. But if you are doing batch setup, you may have quite a few rental assistance contracts and you will enter the date of the earliest one. Then before funding the activity, the PJ must select this Add TBRA Beneficiary button and enter the assistance information for at least one household, including the security deposit and monthly rent amounts. So here on the next screen, the PJ must enter the security deposit. Okay, yep, arrow's still not working. So you'll see the arrow here is just pointing to the security deposit line there, but then you also would enter the TBRA subsidy amount and the number of months in the tenant contract. And it's really important that these fields are entered correctly because of that limitation that I mentioned a moment ago. The eligible TBRA funding amount, that's going to limit how much you can actually fund this activity for. That calculation is based on what you've entered here. So essentially, you're adding up the security deposit and the TBRA subsidy times the number of months that you will be providing that subsidy. So this is an example of the message that you will receive when you enter that information. It says that the TBRA beneficiary has been added, so that's saved, but you get the warning letting you know that the activity funding of $0 is not equal to the amount eligible for TBRA funding, which would be $12,400 based on the beneficiary data entered. The activity cannot be marked as completed. So again, that was taking our TBRA subsidy of $950 times the number of months, which is 12, plus the security deposit of $1,000 and getting $12,400. Because it doesn't match how much we funded the activity for, we can't complete the activity. So the next thing that you would do is enter any project delivery costs. So for our example, we'll enter $1,500 here at the bottom of the screen. And that would, again, go into your formula for the eligible TBRA funding amount based on the beneficiary data entered. The yellow arrow is pointing to where that field is listed. It's a bit small, but it's definitely something you want to make sure you pay attention to. And you'll note that the amount has now gone up by $1,500. It was $12,400 before. We entered $1,500 in project delivery costs, so now we have $13,900. So we would save. And for the sake of our example, we're going to say that we have entered several more beneficiaries, and our total amount for the eligible TBRA funding is $41,250. We still have this warning letting us know that the actual funding amount doesn't match our eligible amount. It won't allow us to complete the activity. So next we will go to the activity funding screen, and we will enter $41,250, which matches our eligible TBRA funding amount. We see these numbers all match. The activity was funded successfully, and that would allow us to save and complete the activity. That is all the beneficiary information that we are required to report on. So I now want to talk just really briefly about how to use MicroStrategy as you all are working on your HOME-ARP projects and activities. Most of you probably know this, but MicroStrategy is our reporting program within IDIS. So I'm going to show you how to get there and just a few pointers on HOME-ARP reports in MicroStrategy. So you would just go to reports the same way you may be familiar with by going to the reports tab on the home screen of IDIS, and that'll take you here to the IDIS folder. You'll next go to the shared reports folder, and you'll see here that this screen lists all of the reports for all of the programs. You'll notice that several reports do not have PR numbers, and they're listed here at the top. And the rest of the reports are listed by PR and then in numerical order. Most home reports have a version of the same report for HOME-ARP. And there are also several reports that are specific to HOME-ARP, like supportive services and non-congregate shelter that you see here listed at the top. It's also important to note that you won't see HOME-ARP listed in the title of any of these PR reports. But there are two ways to run the reports for HOME-ARP. Either you will see a subfolder labeled HOME-ARP. For example, if you select the PR23 Summary of Accomplishments report, you see on the following screen a subfolder here with the option to run the PR23 for HOME-ARP. Other reports, like the PR27, will not have a separate subfolder report for HOME-ARP, but instead, HOME-ARP will be a filter option once you get further into the report and get to the prompt screen. So there's plenty to explore within MicroStrategy, all of the reports that you are using for home, plus some new ones specific to HOME-ARP. And we have an entire webinar devoted to HOME-ARP reporting on the HUD.gov page, as well as HUD Exchange. So check those out if you're interested. We also have a whole bunch of additional resources listed here with links on all of the topics that we've talked about today. So definitely check those out. And with that, I will hand it back to our host. I believe it is Marion to facilitate Q&A.
This is Dan Coughlin. Just before we do go to the Q&A, we had a quick point of correction, or I guess it's a two-point point of correction. So one is that in the chat there was brought up that there was an error in the slide. I think it was slide 19 regarding the rental project targeting. So it is correct that 80% of, rather low-income households are defined as 80% of AMI, right? So we just want to confirm that. Second is that I think it was maybe through an inexactness of language. It sounded like when we were talking about the operating cost assistance, that could be used for any HOME-ARP unit. Just a quick point of clarification on that. It's any HOME-ARP unit that meets that has a qualifying population occupying the unit, right? That it's not any unit, it's just any unit that includes a QP. So a unit that was income based, like what we were describing just now, would not qualify for operating cost assistance. That would be only QP households. Okay, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to all the OAHP staff for the presentation. We're now going to move into the Q&A section of today's office hour, and we're going to start with some admin questions. And so the first one is regarding the procurement, and the question is, what is the procurement responsibilities for a developer when they're given HOME-ARP funds?
Hi, good afternoon, Marion. This is Diane Thompson. I think I'll answer this question. I'll answer it a bit more broadly, though, than asked by discussing the applicability of procurement requirements to contractors, subrecipients, and developers. When a PJ wishes to select a contractor to provide goods or services, the PJ must select the contractor through applicable state and local procurement procedures and requirements. The contractor, of course, is providing goods or services, and it has to be in accordance with a written agreement, which is the contract. The PJ's selection of a subrecipient to administer either some or all of its program is not subject to procurement procedures and requirements. But if a subrecipient will select a contractor to provide a service, then procurement requirements must be followed. Procurement requirements do not apply to developers that are selecting subcontractors to, for example, perform work on a HOME-ARP project.
Thank you so much, Diane. We're going to move on to another admin question. And this is regarding PJ oversight. And what are PJ oversight responsibilities when it comes to subrecipients?
I'll take that one too. The PJ is responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of its HOME-ARP program, similarly to the HOME program, right? They have to ensure that HOME-ARP funds are used in accordance with all the program requirements and written agreements, and they have to take appropriate action when performance problems arise. Also, the use of subrecipients that does not relieve the PJ of any of these responsibilities, right? The performance and compliance of each subrecipient, it must be reviewed at least annually by the PJ. And the PJ has to have and follow written policies and procedures and systems, including a system of assessing the risk of activities and projects, and a system for monitoring entities consistent with the HOME-ARP notice to ensure that the requirements of the notice are in fact met.
Thank you, Diane, for those valuable information. We have a couple more admin questions that we're going to get into. This next one is very long, so let me know if I need to repeat any parts of it. Regarding eligible recipients or subrecipients of HOME-ARP funds, are CAP agencies and PHAs eligible to apply for and receive HOME-ARP funds? What is unclear is that because of entities like PHAs primarily focus on activities that would not be eligible, such as Section 8, would that preclude them from being able to receive HOME-ARP funds generally, even if they apply with a clear intent of only using the funds for HOME-ARP eligible projects?
Marion, this is Jenny Sardone. I'll take that one. So there isn't anything in the federal regulations that would preclude a CAP agency, a PHA, or even a nonprofit organization from receiving HOME-ARP funds for an activity. However, this is really sort of the specific decisions about what types of entities will be available to or eligible to apply for any particular type of activity is really a PJ choice. So, no, there's not a federal prohibition, but it really matters what types of activities a state or local PJ is going to undertake, and what types of organizations they are looking for to administer activities or projects for them.
That's good to know. Thank you so much, Jenny. And we're going to ask one more admin question before we move on to another topic area. Do you have any guidance for PJs with employee turnover?
Sorry, I'm gonna take that. This is Henrietta Owusu. I apologize. I was trying to navigate and I'm doing too many things at a time. So PJs with employee turnover, I mean, as we know, that is something that happens in a lot of organizations, right? I think that from the HUD point of view, when we hear this, what we point PJs to are your policies and procedures. If PJ has good policies and procedures, it will provide, obviously, a roadmap, right, for new staff that are coming in, and allow them to have a good understanding of what it is that are their roles and responsibilities with respect to administering the program. So, I just want to very quickly just point out that your policy is a comprehensive guide that outlines the rules or guidelines for administering your HOME-ARP program. In addition to sort of giving a roadmap on how you're doing things, it also ensures that you're complying with the program requirements. It ensures that there's fairness and consistency in that interpretation of program requirements. And your procedures are the processes for the program administration, right? It outlines the responsibilities associated with the management of the grant within your organization. right? So if you have folks that are turning over and you have a comprehensive guide like this, you will be able to use that to really help them, kind of bring them up to speed and get them quickly to understand what is going on. I just also want to point out that, we definitely understand that, huge, high employee turnover does cause disruptions in operations, right? There's no doubt about it. But if you have these policies and procedures in place, you mitigate that. It may not take it to zero, but it's a great mitigation tool. We're working on a capacity assessment tool right now that we're trying to get out, and that I think will be very helpful to PJs in assessing the capacity that they need. I can go on and on. I think the last thing that I'm going to say about this is that training and development, HUD is an amazing partner in that. We do have a lot of products on the HUD exchange. I wouldn't be the policy director without failing to plug e-building home. So our e-building home training is something that I'm immensely proud of. It is interactive. It's a really good way of understanding the home program basics. Those are the things tools that you have, right, for employee turnover. Turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. That is a wealth of information. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jessica to go over some additional topic questions.
Great. Thank you. And we encourage everyone to continue to add questions into the chat box. And as we are able to, we'll get to them. Some of the questions that we're going over now, we received as part of registration. And so we want to try to get through as many of these questions as possible. And I think Henrietta really teed us up well to talk a little bit further about some of the requirements when thinking about documentation. And so I'm going to ask a TBRA related question. What are the subrecipient written agreement requirements for TBRA?
Okay, this is Mila. I can take that one. So we don't have a lot of time to cover this, and this is actually more complex than I will respond. But first of all, I just want to point out that you can locate written guidance on the written agreement requirements that must be addressed by a PJ when they're using a subrecipient to administer a TBRA program. You can find this in the HOME-ARP notice, section 8, under the program administration requirements. These would be pages 75 through 80. And also in the home regulations at 24 CFR 92/504, and specifically paragraph C2. Now, overall, the TBA requirements or provisions that need to be included in a written agreement between a PJ and its subrecipients will be largely driven by the program design decisions that the PJ makes and the responsibilities and or duties that the PJ is passing on or requiring the subrecipient to carry out. At a minimum, the PJ must address the following. So first and and most important here is that before dispersing any HOME-ARP funds to a subrecipient, the PJ must execute a written agreement with that entity. And in that written agreement, the PJ will require compliance with the applicable TBRA requirements that are in the HOME-ARP notice, and also the regulations that were not waived. In addition to that, it would include requirements that reflect the specific TBRA program that the PJ has designed to address its local needs. And that will look differently for every PJ. But most important here is in your written agreements, make sure to identify who your subrecipient is, what roles and responsibilities you are playing, you, the PJ, and the subrecipient is going to play here. And make sure to address, at a minimum, the use of the HOME-ARP funds, right? The amount of HOME-ARP funds or funding that you are providing through the written agreement to the subrecipient, which essentially covers the forms of assistance that are going to be available under your TBRA program. So are you permitting what assistance is available, right? Rental assistance, security deposits, utility deposits, and any assistance with ongoing utility bills. Also ensure to address the question of administrative funds that you may be providing your subrecipient to administer the cost, right? To administer your program, and any decisions you make around where are some of the soft costs that are considered project delivery expenses, whether those should be billed to your to their admin pot, or whether they can be charged to the project. In those written agreements, you also want to address larger sort of program policy requirements around eligibility. Who's eligible? The tenant selection requirements that you establish for your TBRA program in your HOME-ARP allocation plan. Requirements around leases and ensuring that the tenant protections stay in place, and what VAWA requirements apply through those leases. Decisions you made around the portability of assistance, whether you limited your assistance to stay within your jurisdiction, and or if you're going to permit for some of that to be portable, and the procedures around that. Decisions around the terms of your TBRA contract, who they should be executed with. We have 3 different entities we identified. When you do your TBRA contracts, you make a decision around that and communicate that to your subrecipient. How much assistance is going to be available under your program, and any renewal policies. I mean, the list goes on and on. Applicable rent standards, which are typically used to determine the rental assistance that goes to a family. Procedures for complying with rent reasonableness, any applicable utility allowances. Any procedures around tenant contributions to rent, and whether, and how the income determinations will be made to make that decision. Procedures for unit inspections, disbursement of funds, and how they would be getting paid. Any records and reports that the PJ will need to gather from the subrecipient for the program file, the program requirements, and then also for each assisted family under the PJ's program. Default clauses, so what actions the PJ will take for non-compliance with those agreements, and then the list goes on, and other federal requirements, right? This is not a full list of TBRA requirements, but it's a brief sort of description of the major requirements that are listed in the notice. And also, for a full list, you really can go to our regulations, and it's spelled out a little bit more there.
Thank you so much. So the moral of the story is make sure that you're reading that notice fully and following those regulations. I think with kind of all of the requirements that are in there, one of the questions that we get quite a bit, are there any standard forms or checklists that applicants or subrecipients should be using? And if so, where can they be found? Just talk about any of the templates that might be available on written agreements or underwriting. If those are under development, when might they be released? But just some general questions around when will some available products be available to PJs?
So, Jessica, this is Henrietta again. I will take that. So there are no mandated or standard forms required by the notice by CPD 2110 for applicants or subrecipients. HUD is actually working with TIA providers to develop written agreement checklists to assist PJs in creating agreements with subrecipients and other program partners. These checklists are optional and will be issued as guidance, obviously. Eventually, we're also hoping that with our TA, we'll be able to provide fillable templates for written agreements, which can be customized with, PJs with your council to align with your program design, right? For now, we're just focusing on the developing the checklist, and that will give you a good sense of what it needs to be included in your agreements. I just want to really plug, please collaborate with your council as you pull together your agreements. These are legal documents that bind your respective agencies. So keep in mind that, if you have no enforcement mechanisms, for example, in your agreement, repayment may be required if then, whoever you're contracting with is not able to comply with the requirements. On the underwriting tool, I know there were a lot of parts to this question. On the underwriting tool, we're actually working on an underwriting tool with our providers. I know that it's needed like yesterday. We're working diligently on that. I don't have release dates, but please know that HUD recognizes the urgent need for these tools, and we're working really diligently to make them available as soon as possible. I hope I covered all the parts of this.
You did. Thank you. And
Okay.
we want to make sure that everyone knows that on the HUD Exchange, there is a HOME-ARP page where a lot of the products and existing webinars that we have already completed are posted. And we encourage you to sign up for the listserv so that when some of these other products that Henrietta just mentioned are released, you'll get notification on when they're available, hot off the press. And again, some questions about where will this slide deck be? The HUD Exchange is the place to go, and someone has added that to the chat box, the link to take you directly there. And so just, take a look at that. There's also the opportunity to apply and request technical assistance, which you can do on the HUD Exchange. And so we encourage you to take the advantage of that opportunity as well. I'm going to ask one more question, and this is going to be a rental housing related question. We've gotten a couple of these in the chat before I turn it back over to Marion to go forward. But so the question is, can you provide clarity on the maximum rent in a HOME-ARP rental project for QPs for the first and then the following years?
Hi, Jessica. This is Martha. I'm happy to take that question. So the HOME-ARP program, we use the home rent limits, which are published annually and posted on our website. So for a QP restricted unit, the maximum rent would be the published low home rent. However, if the project has project-based rental assistance or the household receives TBRA, then the rent would be the rent permissible under the rental assistance program. And then the notice also establishes specific rent limits if the project includes SROs, and those rent limits are based on the 0-bedroom fair market rent. So I suggest you take a look at the rental section of the notice. I think it's actually on page 30. In subsequent years, the PJ is required to provide the project owner with the updated HOME-ARP rents that are the published limits, rather, once they become effective. The project owner is expected to examine the QP household's income in all subsequent years and adjust the household's rent accordingly, which is very similar to sort of how we do it with the home program. If the household's income is above 50% but below 80% AMI, then the maximum unit rent, QP unit rent, would increase to the no more than the high home rent. And if the household's income is above 80% AMI, then the household must pay the lesser of the amount payable under state or local law, or 30% of the QP household's monthly adjusted rent. There's obviously other considerations if there are other funding sources included in the project, like tax credit, and as I mentioned, project or tenant-based rental subsidies. We're currently working on a HOME-ARP rental compliance guidebook that's actually going to go into greater detail on sort of the rents, the unit mix, and the long-term sort of compliance, how you actually adjust the rent for both QP households and for LI households. But that should kind of give you an idea how it should work for the QP households. And I would also note that the PJ needs to have policies and procedures for determining how they're going to consider or determine a QP household's contribution to rent. So while the rent limit may be the low home rent, you have to determine what share of that rent the QP household will contribute as rent. So the PJ is going to have policies and procedures for that. And the PJ project owner will have to reassess that rental contribution in subsequent years as well.
Thank you so much, Martha.
Great. Okay, so continuing along with the TBRA questions. Again, you can drop your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. In terms of the TBRA, what is included in the project delivery costs?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I hit the wrong button. Okay, so project delivery costs under TBRA. So we have a general definition here that project delivery costs under TBRA are costs for staff and overhead costs of the PJ and the subrecipient, or its subrecipient if they're using one to administer its TBRA program, that are directly related to carrying out or delivering the TBRA project. And so these would be the PJ may charge eligible project soft costs, such as conducting unit inspections, including lead-based paint evaluations. So those would be the visual assessments, inspections, and risk assessments. Any cost or staff time spent on income eligibility determinations. Now, this would only be applicable if the PJ's program requires that the household make a contribution towards rent. Income determination is not done generally for eligibility for assistance under TBRA, HOME-ARP TBRA. It would only be done if to determine how much a household can pay towards their rent. And then the overall cost for determining the rental assistance payment, executing contracts and things like that of the assisted household. Those would be the eligible project delivery costs that could be charged. Instead of charging that time or the cost to admin, it can be charged as a project cost. And those would have to be actual costs that are incurred by the PJ for that specific household. They cannot be estimates of cost.
Thank you so much, Mila. And we're going to move on to one more TBRA question. What kind of unit inspections do we need to have for TBRA units? And can we charge all these costs to project delivery costs?
Okay, so in the HOME-ARP notice in the TBRA section, it indicates that any housing occupied by households receiving TBRA, HOME-ARP TBRA, they have to meet housing quality standards. These are in 24 CFR 982, or any successful inspection standards issued by HUD. So these would be for units that are not required to meet any other property standard, unless the tenant is going to be residing in a HOME-ARP unit, in which case the PJ may defer to initial ongoing inspection standards. So generally speaking, those units that are occupied by HOME-ARP TBRA recipients are going to meet HQS unless they're occupying a unit that is subsidized by another funding source that requires a more stringent standard. And yes, the cost of inspecting those units can be charged as project delivery. So it would be the actual cost of time and staff and things like that can be charged as a project cost to that specific household.
Great.
For that specific household, I mean.
Great. Thank you so much, Mila. Okay, we're going to switch gear a little bit. We have some IDIS related questions. First one up, can you provide further guidance on annual or quarterly reporting? And can you share information and how to input quarterly performance data?
I can answer that question. This is Danielle Frazier. Thank you. So there is no required annual reporting for HOME-ARP, and the only required quarterly reporting is for supportive services activities. We will talk about that in the next office hours and go through all of that. However, in the interim, We do have a fact sheet on the HUD Exchange that that will discuss supportive services activities. You are required to report that quarterly, and then there is on the accomplishment screens, that's where you would report for supportive services quarterly. And then also for everything else, there's the regular screens as they showed you today for the rental and the TBRA. They showed you where to do all the reporting for that. And we ask that you do that as the data comes in. Obviously, once the units are leased up, please enter the beneficiary information. You're going to have to enter all the TBRA information prior to being able to fund that activity anyway.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And a follow-up question regarding the beneficiary. Do we report each beneficiary served each quarter, or only new homeless or non-homeless beneficiaries each quarter?
So for supportive services, you are going to report on every beneficiary you serve every quarter. You're going to have to separate out your reporting, whether it's going to be a new household homeless or a new non-homeless household versus an existing homeless or non-homeless beneficiary. So each quarter you will be required to report on anyone that you've provided services to.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to ask some additional questions.
Okay, a couple more IDIS questions. And so want to know, one particular person was having issues uploading documents and wanted to know if we could share how would they go about uploading those documents.
I'm not actually quite sure what documents they're referring to upload. I believe the only ones that they needed to was the allocation plan and those types of things when they were submitting. There are no other documents that you have to upload when it comes to reporting. However, if there's something very specific that they're referring to, they can send us an email at the HOME-ARP at HUD.gov email box, and we can work with them directly on answering that question for them.
Wonderful, thank you. And the next two questions are somewhat related to like the either uploading of things or access to IDIS. So what year should they tie projects and activities to, which won't begin until 2025?
It doesn't matter which year you're setting up your activities for, you will always tie it to your program year 2021, because that's the year of the HOME-ARP funding. So you must always tie it, no matter what, to 2021. And we do also have a fact sheet on that on the HUD Exchange page that you can look at.
Perfect. And then any advice that you have on obtaining IDIS access?
If you are someone on a PJ that will be using IDIS, you would need to contact your CPD rep in the field, and they would assist you with getting the correct forms filled out and go from there. So contact your CPD rep in your field office.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, one more IDIS question before I turn it back over. If one project has been awarded funding for multiple HOME-ARP activities, such as rental, nonprofit capacity building, supportive services, would these activities be linked in IDIS, or would they be separate setups and closeouts?
They would need to be separated out. For one, the rental activity has different requirements than obviously the supportive services. And for non-profit capacity building, that is a completely different process. You would be sub-funding and sub-granting for that anyway, which would come out of a different portion of it. So yes, they would need to be separate activities. You could put in your description that this is related to a rental activity ID number, blah, 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 blah. And that way we know when we're reviewing that those comments or the activity descriptions, we at least know that they're somewhat tied together, but you will need to set up separate activities. And we do have tutorials as well on how to sub-fund and sub-grant for capacity building as well on the HUD Exchange under the IDIS section of the topics area.
Thank you. And there is just an enormous amount of helpful information there on that page. And so we encourage you, any IDIS setup questions or anything related to HOME-ARP that you may need to go back to and take a look at later on, please make sure you bookmark that and have those resources available to you. So we'll turn it over to Marion, and she'll ask our next set of questions.
Thank you so much. Okay, we know as things change, we may need to request substantial amendments. So we're going to switch gear a bit. What are the citizen participation requirements? Are there procedures for amending plans?
Hi, this is Shannon, and I'll be taking that question if that works. For HOME-ARP, we do anticipate that several of the PJs, you all will be submitting substantial amendments as you make changes to your plans and as time goes on. The citizen participation requirements for a substantial amendment are that there's a public comment period for 15 days. Most and typically substantial amendments require a 30-day public comment period. However, for HOME-ARP, this has been waived and 15 days are required. Unlike when you submitted your initial allocation plans, the so it has to be, there's the public comment period, but the I'm just losing everything here. Okay, so the public comment period is required, but the I'm sorry, I'm losing everything on my computer for 2 seconds. Having a public hearing is not required. Sorry, there we go. So public hearing is only required when you submitted your initial substantial amendments. The process for submitting the substantial amendment is going to be similar to when you submitted your allocation plan. And like Danielle was saying, it needs to be done in the 2021 annual action plan or con plan, depending. And with that, you end up always in the 2021 year. And the procedures are to submit based on following the regular substantial amendment plans. And the same triggers are required for other substantial amendments. However, except for HOME-ARP, there's an additional requirement for if you're adding a preference or a limitation or a method of prioritization, that will also trigger a substantial amendment. And for a list of the substantial amendment triggers, you can look to the notice for that as well. Once you submit your substantial amendment, the field office would be able to review your submission, and they'll respond within 45 days with a letter or saying it's either accepted or that there need to be changes, just like it was when the original allocation plans were submitted. I'm sorry about the information blurb there. So essentially, the substantial amendments submitted, 15 days are required for the public comment period, and there isn't a requirement for
I think Shannon answered the question. We're going to go ahead and move on to, we only have a few more minutes, to another substantial amendment question. What are the tenant selection procedure when state PJ does not impose preferences or limitations in allocation plan or RFA, but an agency that applies for the PJ for HOME-ARP funding uses preferences or limitations established by their local needs and other program funding outside of HOME-ARP?
Hi, this is Kim, and I'll be taking that question. So there's a little bit to unpack here. So, as Shannon just mentioned, that one of the triggers for a substantial amendment would be if a PJ elects to implement a preference that it had not originally described in its allocation plan. So if the state or other PJ says, gee, I really like that proposal that, this organization submitted, we want to fund it, then the PJ will have to go through a substantial amendment process. Alternatively, the PJ could say, this applicant wasn't responsive to our RFP or RFA because we don't wish to establish any preferences, and then the PJ could decide not to implement or not to fund the activity and stay in alignment with its existing allocation plan. You know, if the in terms of answering what tenant selection procedures would be implemented, it really depends upon whether or not the applicant wants to use COC, coordinated entry, if it wants to limit within a certain QP. So that, question really can't be fully answered, but, our default always is a project specific wait list. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. No, we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to ask a couple more questions.
Thank you so much. We have two that are one rental housing related and one that's rental housing and TBRA. And I think these are two important ones to wrap up for today. So the first one is, what is the maximum rent contribution for a QP with no income? Is the unit zero rent because that's 30% of their income?
I was actually just sort of writing up a response to some of the questions. So there's a couple things you have to understand. There is the rent that can be charged for the unit. So that in a project that has no other sort of subsidies, no other funding sources, would be no more than the low home rent. There is also what we call the tenant contribution, which the PJ has to have policies and procedures for. When a QP household is put into a rental unit, the PJ has to determine a contribution to rent that is affordable to that household. And we leave that up to the PJ. In many cases, it'd probably be no more than 30% of that household's income. But I've just totally lost my train of thought. But you need to consider both of those things when underwriting, for the project, because you may end up with, a low home rent of say $100 and a QP household that can only contribute 20. Once you look at the operating cost, there may be an operating deficit associated with that QP unit. And that's where your capitalized operating reserve comes into play. You could pay for any deficit associated with that QP unit to make sure you're covering that full rent amount. So it would be the tenant contribution plus, sort of the payments from the operating reserve to cover the deficit, which would get you up to sort of your underwritten low home rent amount. Hopefully that makes sense and answers the question.
Thank you, Martha. And I want to be mindful of the time. We have 1 minute left, and I don't know that we'll be able to answer this last question. So I think we'll just do a closeout and then, let everyone know of some of the resources that are available. So we just want to thank you for today. Again, the HUD Exchange and the HOME-ARP page is a great place for you to go to start kind of looking for additional resources available to answer some of the questions that you all have posed here and that we haven't been able to get to today. Strongly encourage you to take a look at the notice and just, keep an eye out on being on the HUD Exchange listserv. But Marion, I want to pass it to you to just give us the final closeout.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you to the HOME-ARP staff for today's presentation, office hour. Thank you for the participants. I hope this information presented today will help with the implementation and the continued carrying out of your projects for the HOME-ARP. We hope to see you on our next virtual presentation and also the next quarterly office hour. Thank you, and y'all have a wonderful day.